Hey, what's going on everyone? In this review, we'll be looking at one of the more interesting lead Gundams out there, the RX-79G Gundam EZ-8. Now I'm a huge fan of the 08th MS team, so despite this kit being over a decade and a half old, I'm really hoping this Master Grade holds up. So as always, we'll be reviewing this Master Grade Gundam in 4 categories: the build, appearance, articulation, and the gimmicks. We'll be scoring each from 1 to 5, so at the end we can tally it all up for an average score. Hopefully this review can help you decide if you should pick up this kit or wait for a 2.0. Now let's jump right into this build. The initial snap build for this guy is of course very similar to the Master Grade Ground Gundam, which came out a few months earlier. He actually uses the exact same inner frame. Thankfully, this frame is pretty solid for its time period, and a great way for beginners to get into old school Master Grades. However, it does have a few screws in the arms to deal with, and some poor seam lines and nubs here or there. It's nothing too crazy, but definitely check out the Ground Gundam review after this, as a lot of what I said about that kit carries over to this kit. The only real difference between this guy and the Ground Gundam, outside of the colors of course, is the layout of the leg armor. The upper chest is bulked up to include a pull-out gimmick, and the head is a completely new build. Speaking of the head, it's really the only part of this build to have major problems. First up, this red section on the chin is a pretty bad sticker. Thankfully this section is raised up, so it isn't too much of a hassle to paint. Next, this whole chin section is a separate piece with a tendency to pop off. I got so tired of it falling off actually, I ended up just gluing it down, and even then there's a bit of a gap here. And lastly, there's some issues with these antennae. This smaller antenna needs to be glued in. Yeah, there's nowhere to snap it in. Glue is absolutely mandatory. Then there's this big antenna that does snap in, but this section here is actually supposed to be off-white. Honestly, I don't think it's even possible to color match this weird tannish base color, especially since you're painting over a darker surface. So if you want this piece to color match, it's probably going to mean a full paint job. Now, as far as detailing goes, there isn't anything really that mandatory outside of fixing those issues on the head and some basic panel lining around the suit. I would say he looks really good with some added gray to the inside of the armor, specifically on the skirts and the inside of the shoulder. This is such a great touch-up you can do on pretty much any old school Master Grade. I also recommend adding gray to these little sections on the front of the leg. There's pretty decent part separation here, so they don't take too long to do. And really, that about does it for the build. It's a pretty solid old school Master Grade. I'd like to give this kit the same score as the Ground Gundam, a 4 out of 5, but this head really knocks it down a peg. All said and done, we'll give this build a still respectable 3.5 out of 5. It's just above average, but the build for the head keeps it from being anything that great. Now let's hope his appearance fares a little bit better. Honestly, I loved the look of the Master Grade Ground Gundam, specifically the colors, and despite not being perfect, I really liked the proportions. So I'm not really sure what happened with this EZ-8. Don't get me wrong here, I actually really like the more industrial look of this Gundam, but this Master Grade just doesn't do it justice. Maybe it's the mix of a reused inner frame and the newer parts retrofitted to it, but the chest is just way too bulky, the arms are too slender, and the head is just way too big for this body. It's a real letdown. Moving on to the colors, well, they aren't exactly great either. While the gray on the inner frame looks fine, the greenish blue is a little too dark, and the off-white is a little too, off. I was expecting more of a tannish color, like it is in the anime, but for some reason this leans a bit more into off-white instead. Of course, fixing the colors here shouldn't be that hard, considering how solid some of the part separation is. Moving on to the decals, you get 2 sheets of them. The first is the standard peel and stick caution signs. Nothing really interesting here outside of a few Federation symbols. The second is a set of dry transfer model numbers. Unlike the Ground Gundam though, you don't get too many different numbers. It's just a set for the 08th MS team. I guess that makes sense canonically, but still, it's a little lazy on Bandai's part. Thankfully you do get those optional vents the Ground Gundam came with. Yeah, these are little extra hatches and vents that you can glue on to add some personal detail. So what can I say about the appearance here? Well, it's not great. Still, this is recognizable as the EZ-8, and if you put some work into the colors, you can look half decent. I'll give this kit's appearance a decent 3 out of 5. Honestly, it's the proportions that hurt most in my book. Now let's see if this articulation can get this kit back on track. Starting at the feet, well, they're just the usual bricks, pretty standard for an old school Master Grade. The ankles are on a set of hinges, so you don't get ball joint level movement, but you get enough for basic standing poses. The knee has a solid 90-degree bend. Really, it's like a perfect right angle. The hips are the old style ball and socket setup, so you get good kicks, some okay spins, but not much else. There is a little extra swivel though, that allows you to move the legs laterally. It's supposed to help with crouching poses, but unfortunately it's only ever made this kit difficult to stand up straight. The waist skirts are about average, with the back skirt locked in place. The chest is this huge brick connected to the waist with a single ball joint, so don't expect any ab crunches here. The shoulders are a ball and socket connected to a hinge, so you get the usual 360-degree spin and some basic lateral movement. You do get an extra pop out though, which is pretty nice, but it's more the side effect of a weak polycap than anything. The arms have a little more than a 135-degree bend. This top section on the arm does have a tendency to slide off though. As for the hands, you get the old style trigger finger split, a dedicated closed set, and a dedicated open set. Unfortunately, there are no pegs on any of these hands, but I'll get to that in the next part. The head is on a single ball joint, so you don't get much. The size of this head really hurts too. And that's about it for the articulation. Nothing that really stands out, but he can still do the usual standing poses. It's your old school master grade for sure. I'll give this articulation another 3 out of 5. You only get the usual standing and basic shooting pose here, but it could be a lot worse. And lastly, let's take a look at these weapons. First up is the EZ8's most iconic weapon, this machine gun. It looks fine and the white ammo pack goes a long way in spicing it up, but unfortunately the lack of pegs really hurts here. He can't hold this gun up at all. Like the Wing Zero I just reviewed, you're definitely going to need some sticky tack or tape if you want this gun to be held up right. The beam sabers don't suffer from this problem though. They're simple enough to not be affected by the lack of pegs. Just like the Ground Gundam, you can store these beam sabers in the side of the leg. It's always worked just fine for me, but I've heard some people have issues getting these beam sabers secured properly. There's actually another gimmick for the suit itself. You can open up the chest to reveal some machinery. While it does look cool, and I bet you could paint this up and have it looking really nice, I can't help but think this is the reason the chest looks so bulky and bloated. Now back to the weapons. Next up is his beam rifle. Unfortunately, it requires a ton of painting, specifically white over gray, so odds are this one's going in the Ziploc bag. Last for his basic arsenal is this shield. You know, I've always loved the design of the 08th MS team shields. It's just such a clean design, you know? Now for the major weapon of this kit, you get this massive cannon. Amazingly, despite its size, it actually isn't that difficult to hold up. Because it sits on top of the shoulder, he doesn't really need to have a firm grip with his hand, meaning the lack of pegs aren't a factor here. Of course, this articulation prevents this guy from doing anything really stand out, but still, it's a massive improvement over that gun from the Ground Gundam. The cannon can also be broken up into smaller sections and stored in this dedicated container, which fits into the backpack. It makes the kit sort of back heavy, but not to the point where you can't stand up straight. The lack of chest articulation does have its positives, I guess. And that wraps up these gimmicks. I actually think this is an improvement over the Ground Gundam, mainly because of that cannon. I'll give the gimmicks for this kit a solid 4 out of 5. Just remember to have some sticky tack for the machine gun and some paint for that beam rifle. Okay, time to wrap this up for an average score. The build was a 3.5 out of 5. It's a pretty straightforward old school master grade. There are some trouble spots with the head though. The appearance was a 3 out of 5. I feel reusing the Ground Gundam inner frame really hinders this guy from looking too cohesive. The articulation was another 3 out of 5. He can do the 2 or 3 standing poses you need, but not too much else. And the gimmicks received a 4 out of 5. Despite the lack of pegs, this master grade fares pretty well. Alright, tallying that all up, dividing, and of course rounding, this master grade EZ8 receives a 3.4 out of 5. More accurately, in terms of a percentage, it receives a 67.5%. That seems really low in terms of my reviews. While it's not as bad as the GP01FB, the weak appearance and lackluster articulation really hurts this kit. The Ground Gundam, despite coming out first, is just a better kit than this. Still, I think this guy deserves a place on my shelf, and I don't regret picking him up. I would, however, not be against a 2.0. Okay, that about does it. Feel free to ask any questions or comments you have about this kit below, and I'm more than happy to get back to you. You can also follow me on Instagram at RedHeadphone6. I post updates, work in progress builds, the whole thing. Alright, thanks for watching, and see you next time.